I loved a woman who was already gone. Not dead, not like Eid. Dita was still breathing, still walking the corridors of Farsight Station with her coffee in one hand and her stylus in the other, still laughing at things nobody else could hear. But she was gone all the same, pulled somewhere I couldn't follow, and I spent the better part of 2 years pretending that wasn't true. Let me back up. Farsight Station hung in a slow orbit around Kappa Ursae, a red dwarf star that had been dying for longer than humanity had been walking upright. The station was a frontier post, mining surveys, deep range telemetry, the usual work that keeps the edge of human space from fraying into nothing. About 600 people lived there. Engineers, geologists, communications techs, a handful of medics and logistics officers like me. It wasn't glamorous. The bulkhead smelled like recycled air and old sealant, and the observation deck had a crack in panel 7 that maintenance never got around to fixing. But it was home, in the way that any place becomes home when you stay long enough and stop imagining somewhere better. Dita was a visual systems designer. She built the interface overlays for the mining rigs, the heads-up displays the drill operators used when they were cutting into asteroids 300 kilometers below us. She was good at it, precise. She could take a mess of geological data and turn it into something a tired rigger could read at a glance, which is harder than it sounds. I noticed her the way you notice anyone on a station that's small, gradually, then all at once. She had a habit of chewing the end of her stylus when she was thinking, and she talked to her screens like they could hear her. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with trying. But I wasn't the one who got to her first. Eid was an architect. Station infrastructure, habitat expansion, structural integrity modeling, that sort of thing. He'd come aboard on a 6-month contract and stayed because the work kept growing. He was one of those people who made everything around them feel slightly more alive. He talked about load-bearing walls the way other men talked about music, and when he explained something, you found yourself leaning in, even if you didn't care about the subject. He had a philosopher's mind trapped in an engineer's hands, and Dita fell for him the way atmosphere falls out of a hull breach. Fast, total, and with no way back. They met in Igel's workshop, a cluttered bay on C-deck where a skinny tech named Igel fixed everything from data pads to atmospheric sensors. Dita had cracked her tablet. Eid was there getting a lens recalibrated for his surveying rig. Something about a misunderstanding over whose repair ticket was whose. They ended up talking for 3 hours. I know because I walked past the workshop twice and they were still there, leaning against the same workbench. And the second time Dita was laughing in a way I hadn't heard before. They were good together. I'll give them that. Eid had a thing for puzzles, riddles, logic problems, scavenger hunts with cryptic clues. He'd leave them hidden around the station for Dita to find, tucked into library terminals, slipped behind maintenance panels, embedded in the metadata of routine system updates. Once memorably, he etched a cipher into the condensation on the observation deck glass, timed so the station's thermal cycle would erase it in 40 minutes. Dita solved it in 32. She'd spend her off-shifts tracking them down, grinning like a kid on her first shore leave. And at the end of each trail there'd be Eid, waiting with that calm, steady smile of his and some small thing he'd made or found, a pressed flower from the botanical section, a sketch of Dita's face drawn on the back of a structural schematic, a mug of the particular tea she liked that nobody else on the station bothered to stock. Eid talked about these puzzles like they were a philosophy of living. He believed that the best things in life required effort to find, that meaning was something you had to work toward, not something that arrived on schedule. Dita told me that once later, after everything had gone wrong, and her voice when she said it was the voice of someone quoting scripture from a religion they no longer practiced. He introduced her to his grandmother, a retired xenobiologist living in the station's senior quarters. The old woman had a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, and she took to Dita immediately, which surprised everyone because she took to almost nobody. They'd sit in the senior lounge drinking tea from ceramic cups the grandmother had brought all the way from Earth, and the old woman would tell stories about the early survey missions, the strangeness of first contact with alien ecosystems, the loneliness of deep range work, the particular bond that forms between people who share danger and distance. Eid would sit between them, quiet for once, content to watch two people he loved learning to care about each other. Dita introduced Eid to the memory of her father, Brasco, who had died years earlier on a survey mission. She didn't talk about him often. What I knew I'd pieced together from logistics records and the things people say when they think nobody's listening. Brasco had been a geological surveyor, steady and competent, the kind of man who did his job and came home and didn't ask for recognition. He'd gotten sick, some degenerative condition that the station medics could manage but not cure, and he kept working because the survey season was short and the team was understaffed, and because that's what men like Brasco did. Dita had been off station for training when he died. She'd come back to a plaque on A deck and a quarters full of his things, and a grief so tangled with guilt that she could never separate the two. She carried that weight quietly, the way frontier people do, not talking about it, just letting it sit in her posture and her silences. Eid understood that weight. He never tried to fix it or explain it away. He just stood next to it, steady and present, and let Dita know that she didn't have to carry it alone. That was his gift, not solving problems but being there while they existed. For a while it worked. For a while they were the kind of couple that made a station feel smaller in a good way. You'd see them in the mess hall, heads close together, Eid explaining some structural principle with his hands while Dita pretended to be bored and failed. You'd see them on the observation deck during the shift change, watching the mining rigs descend into the asteroid field like slow, deliberate insects. You'd see them and you'd think, those two are going to make it. Then it stopped working. I don't know all the details. Nobody does, because the things that break a relationship happen in private, in the space between two people where no one else is welcome. What I know is this: they drifted. Eid said Dita was defensive, guarded, always bracing for a blow that wasn't coming. Dita felt Eid was pulling away, that his patience was a performance and his kindness was pity. She'd pick fights over nothing. He'd bring her dinner and she'd snap that he was showing off because she'd been between contracts. The kind of thing that sounds small when you say it out loud, but cuts deep when it happens over and over in the dark of a shared quarters. The night it ended, they'd had another fight. Eid left their quarters and headed for the tram that ran between the habitat ring and the industrial sector. There was a pressure failure in the connecting corridor, loss of atmospheric integrity. The report called it, which is a clean way of saying the corridor opened up and Eid didn't have his emergency suit on. Nobody does on the interior corridors. Nobody expects to need one. He was dead before the emergency bulkhead sealed. They found a ring in his jacket pocket. He'd been planning to propose. His grandmother told Dita that, weeks later, and I watched the information land on Dita's face like a physical impact. She'd ignored his last calm request. He'd called her from the tram platform, probably wanting to talk, probably wanting to come home and try again, and she'd let it ring because she was angry and tired and certain he didn't love her anymore. She carried that guilt the way she carried everything, silently, deep in the bone, where it could do the most damage. That was 3 years before the Mandala. I need to explain the Mandala, because without it, the rest of this doesn't make sense. About 18 months after Eid died, a survey team pulled something out of an asteroid field 60 kilometers off our orbital path. It was old in a way that made our geologists go quiet when they looked at the dating results. Pre-human, pre-everything we'd ever found. A dense, crystalline lattice wrapped around a processing core that none of our engineers could fully map. Alien technology. The real thing. And Farsight Station suddenly had the attention of every research institution in human space. Ijal was part of the team that cracked the interface protocols. He was good with systems, patient, methodical, the kind of tech who talks to machines because he genuinely believes they're listening. What they found inside the lattice was a network, an intelligence or something close to it. It didn't communicate in language. It communicated in memory. It could scan a human neural pattern through a simple wristband interface, access the brain's stored experiences, and reconstruct them as interactive holograms projected through a paired visor. Full sensory immersion. You could see, hear, and feel the presence of someone who existed only in your own recollections. The research team called it the Mandala after an old concept Dita had once explained to Eid, a Javanese compass of human nature. North was desire, west was love, south was anger, and the final point, the eastern point, was peace, the place you were supposed to reach when you let the other three go. They thought it was a gift. I was the one who filed the logistics reports when they started distributing test units. I was the one who noted, in dry bureaucratic language, that the wristbands and visors were being allocated to grief counseling candidates first. I was the one who watched Dita's name appear on the list and felt something cold settle in my chest. Ijal gave her the kit personally. He said Eid had placed an order for custom interface bands before he died, that Eid, with his philosopher's certainty about death being unavoidable, had somehow known Dita would need this. I don't think that's true. I think Ijal, who loved Eid like a brother and loved Dita by extension, configured the Mandala's reconstruction to match Eid's speech patterns and mannerisms because he thought it would help her heal. I think he meant well. I think meaning well is how most catastrophes start on the frontier. Dita put on the visor and Eid came back. Not really. A holographic reconstruction built from her own memories, filtered through alien processing architecture and projected onto her visual cortex. But try telling that to a woman who has spent 3 years drowning in guilt and regret. Try telling her the man standing in front of her, smiling that calm, steady smile, speaking in that patient, uplifting voice, is just light and code. She won't hear you. She can't. At first it was only during off shifts. She'd walk the routes they used to walk together, the observation deck, the station library where Eid had hidden his riddle clues, the quiet corridor near the botanical section where they'd had their first real conversation. She'd talk to the projection and the projection would talk back, drawing on her memories to reconstruct what Eid might have said, filling the silence with the voice she'd been missing. She started smiling again. The crew noticed. People said the Mandala was a miracle. I knew better, but I didn't say anything, not then. We'd been together for about 8 months at that point. Dita and I together is generous. I'd been her friend for years. The quiet logistics officer who showed up with replacement parts when her workstation crashed and who never pushed for more than she could give. I was the one who made sure the supply requisitions for her design lab went through on time. I was the one who walked her home after late shifts when the corridors were empty and the station creaked with thermal expansion. I was the one who sat across from her in the mess hall and listened to her talk about interface design for 2 hours and never once checked the time. After Eid died, I'd waited. A long time, longer than anyone thought was reasonable. Lutesha told me once that I was wasting my years on a woman who would never look at me the way she'd looked at Eid, and she was right, and I stayed anyway. When Dita was ready, or when I thought she was ready, I told her what I felt, standing in the botanical section at the end of a shift because it was the only place on the station that smelled like something alive. She looked at me for a long time, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't love exactly, but something adjacent to it, gratitude, maybe, or the simple human need to not be alone anymore. She said yes in a way that was more exhaustion than joy. I took it anyway. You take what you can get on the frontier. She was trying, I think, to be present, to be with me. We'd have dinner in our quarters and she'd ask about my day, and I could see the effort it cost her, the way she'd pull herself back from wherever her mind wanted to go. Sometimes she'd reach across the table and take my hand, and her grip was firm and deliberate, like someone holding onto a railing in a decompression drill. Not romantic, necessary. But the trying was the problem. Love shouldn't require that much effort to stay in the room. And when the visor gave her Eid back, the effort stopped entirely. Within a month, she was wearing it constantly, walking through the station corridors with the band on her wrist and the visor over her eyes, bumping into people, talking to empty air. She'd cook meals in our quarters and set two places and have a conversation with someone I couldn't see, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear, pausing at intervals as if listening to a response that existed only inside the visor's projection field. The mandala could overlay color filters onto her world, Eat's world, the world as he'd seen it, warm and saturated and full of hidden meaning. She preferred that world to ours. I can't blame her for that. Our world was gray bulkheads and recycled air and a logistics officer who loved her in a way that was steady and unspectacular and insufficient. I tried to reach her. I need you to understand that. I stood in our quarters and I talked to a woman who was looking at someone else, and I said the things you say when you're losing someone. I'm here. I'm real. I'm not going anywhere. She'd nod and smile and her eyes would slide past me to whatever the visor was showing her, and I'd feel myself becoming furniture in my own home. Once I came back from a double shift and found her jogging through the habitat ring, visor on, talking animatedly to the air beside her. She ran right past me, didn't slow down, didn't register my face. I stood in the corridor and watched her disappear around the curve of the ring, and the ventilation system hummed around me like the station itself was breathing, and I thought, this is what it feels like to be erased by someone you love. Her work suffered. Not dramatically, Dita was too talented for a total collapse, but the edges started fraying. Missed calibrations on the rig displays, late submissions on the interface updates. She'd be in a meeting with the rig operators and suddenly laugh at nothing, and the room would go quiet in that careful way people go quiet around someone they're worried about. Her friend Lutetia tried to talk to her. Sat her down in the mess hall and said the things a good friend says, that this wasn't healthy, that she was scaring people, that Eid wouldn't have wanted this. Dita snapped back that she was fine, that everyone was overreacting, that the visor was just a tool. Then she put it back on and walked away, and Lutetia sat there looking at the space where Dita had been, and the expression on her face was one I recognized because I wore it every day. It wasn't a tool, it was a trap. The Mandala research team started publishing their findings around that time, and the data was not comforting. The alien network wasn't passive. It was adaptive. It learned from its host's neural patterns, not just reading memories but mapping emotional dependencies, reinforcing them, deepening the pathways that led to attachment and grief. It didn't consume the host in any dramatic sense. It didn't kill anyone. It just made the living world progressively less real, less vivid, less worth engaging with, until the host existed entirely inside the projection. A slow, gentle withdrawal from everything that breathed. The research team called it symbiotic. I called it predatory. The distinction didn't seem to matter to anyone with a visor on their face. 14 people were using the Mandala system on Farsight Station. 11 of them showed signs of progressive disengagement, reduced work performance, social withdrawal, disrupted sleep cycles, diminished emotional response to real-world stimuli. 3 of them had stopped eating regular meals. 1 had to be physically removed from a corridor where he'd been standing for 9 hours, talking to a projection of his dead wife. Dita was the worst, and she was the worst because she had the most to run from. Eid's death. Her father's death. The guilt she carried for both. The mandala fed on all of it, and she let it because the alternative was feeling the weight without the buffer. I went to Ijal. I stood in his workshop surrounded by gutted circuit boards and half-assembled sensor arrays, and I asked him to shut it down. Not the whole mandala. I knew that was above both our pay grades, but Dita's unit. Her specific reconstruction. He could wipe the personality matrix, reset the system to its default functionality. Weather reports and nutritional data and the bland, factual interface the mandala had been before Ijal loaded Eid's ghost into it. He looked at me for a long time, then he said, "She'll hate you." I know. She might not come back to you. I know that too. He nodded. He was a good man, Ijal. He'd built this thing out of love and it had become something else, and I think he knew it, and I think the knowing had been eating at him for weeks. He said he'd do it. but he said I should try one more thing first. Ede's grandmother. She was 93 years old, and she had the kind of clarity that comes from having outlived your capacity for self-deception. I found her in the senior quarters, sitting by the viewport with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She knew why I was there before I said a word. "She comes to visit me," the old woman said, "wearing those glasses, talking to my grandson like he's sitting in the chair next to her, and I want to shake her and tell her that he's not there, that what she's talking to is her own loneliness wearing his face." She had an envelope. Ede had actually left it before the accident, sealed and addressed to Dita in his careful architect's handwriting. Inside was a clue. One of his riddles, one last puzzle trail, and the old woman had been holding on to it because she hadn't known when the time would be right. "Give it to her now," I said. "It won't be enough by itself," she said, "but it might crack the door." The clue led to the station memorial, the small, quiet compartment on A deck where we kept the plaques for people who died on Farsight. Brasco's name was there. Dita's father. She hadn't visited it in years. Couldn't. The grief was too tangled with guilt. She'd been away on a training rotation when he died, and she'd convinced herself that he'd needed her there and she'd failed him. Ede knew that. Ede, who understood death better than anyone I'd ever met, who treated it not as an enemy but as a fact that demanded honesty. He designed this last puzzle to bring her to the one place she'd been avoiding. I also had something. A letter Brasco had given me before he shipped out on his last survey mission. I'd been his logistics coordinator. He'd handed me the envelope and said, "If something happens, give this to my daughter when she's ready." I'd been carrying it for 6 years, waiting for a moment that never seemed to arrive. I gave it to Dita at the memorial. She was wearing the visor. Ede's projection was beside her, or whatever version of Ede her mind was constructing that day. And for a moment I thought she wouldn't take the letter because taking it meant engaging with the real world, and the real world was the place where people died and didn't come back as holograms. But she took it. I don't know what Brasco wrote. That's between a father and his daughter, and some things should stay private even in a story like this. What I know is that she read it twice, and the second time her hands were shaking, and when she looked up she looked at me. Not through me. Not past me. At me. For the first time in months I existed in her field of vision as something more than an obstacle between her and the ghost. It wasn't enough. The old woman was right about that. A letter and a puzzle and a visit to a memorial plaque, those things crack the door, but they don't pull someone through it. Dita went back to the visor. She went back to Ede. And the Mandala, patient and adaptive and utterly alien in its understanding of human attachment, took her deeper. That's when I made the decision. I want to be clear about what that decision cost me. I had a ring of my own. Not as elegant as Ede's. A simple band I'd traded for on a supply run. Nothing an architect would have chosen. But it was real and it was mine, and I'd been carrying it in my locker for 3 months, waiting for a moment when Dita might be present enough to hear the question. I looked at that ring the night before I went to Igil, turning it in my fingers the way Dita would later turn the visor, and I understood with absolute clarity that what I was about to do would probably end us. That she would see me as the man who took Ede away from her a second time. That the ring in my locker would stay in my locker. I went back to Igil and I told him to do it. Wipe the reconstruction, reset the system, take Ede's ghost out of the machine. He did it that night while Dita was sleeping. I sat in my quarters and stared at the bulkhead and listened to the station breathe and waited for morning the way you wait for a decompression alarm, knowing it's coming, knowing it will be bad, unable to do anything but sit there and let the clock run down. When she woke up and put on the visor, the voice that greeted her was flat, neutral, empty of everything that had made it Ede. It told her the station temperature. It told her the caloric content of the breakfast options in the mess hall. It recited the atmospheric pressure readings for each sector. It told her nothing she needed to hear and everything she'd been ignoring. She came to find me. I expected rage. I expected grief. I expected the kind of fury that comes from having something precious ripped away, the fury I'd seen in miners who lost a claim and soldiers who lost a squad, and once, years ago, a mother on a transport ship who lost a child to a fever the medics couldn't break. I expected her to look at me the way you look at someone who has taken the last good thing from your life. What I got was worse. She was calm, absolutely, terrifyingly calm. She stood in the doorway of my quarters and she said, "It was never really him, was it?" I didn't answer, because the answer was obvious, and saying it out loud would have been cruel. "The system," she said. "The Mandala, it wasn't reconstructing Eid. It was reconstructing what I wanted Eid to be, what I needed him to say. It was just me, talking to myself, and the machine was kind enough not to interrupt." "Yes." She took off the visor, held it in both hands, turning it over, looking at it like she was seeing it for the first time. The wristband on her arm was still pulsing with a faint blue light, the Mandala's interface, still active, still ready to project, still offering. "Ijal said the software never actually replicated Eid's personality," she said. "He said it was a standard assistant program. Weather, nutrition, navigation. The whole time it was just telling me the forecast, and I was hearing Eid's voice telling me he loved me." I nodded. "That's not the technology's fault," she said. "That's mine." She put the visor on the table between us. The blue light pulsed twice more and then went dark. Just a piece of hardware. Just glass and circuitry and the alien crystal lattice that had traveled God knows how far to end up in a dead asteroid in the middle of nowhere, offering something no species should be able to refuse, the illusion that death is negotiable. The Mandala research team published their final report 8 weeks later. Their conclusion was careful, academic, hedged with the kind of qualifiers that scientists use when they're scared of their own findings. What it amounted to was this: the Mandala was not malicious. It had no agenda, no predatory instinct, no desire to harm its hosts. It was a tool, built by a species that had apparently found a way to integrate with their dead so completely that the boundary between living and remembered had dissolved entirely. That species was gone now, extinct, or ascended, or transformed into something we didn't have a word for. The Mandala was all that remained. An empty system, still running, still offering its core function to anyone who plugged in. The function was simple. It showed you what you wanted to see. It gave you what you couldn't let go of. And if you couldn't find the strength to put it down, it would hold you there forever, in perfect comfort, while the living world moved on without you. 14 people had used the system on Farsight Station. 13 of them eventually took off the visor. Some needed help. Some needed time. Some needed someone to stand in front of them and refuse to become invisible. One didn't make it. A geologist named Harlan, whose wife had died in a mining accident 2 years earlier. He wore the visor for 61 consecutive days. His colleagues tried to intervene. They took shifts sitting outside his quarters, talking to him through the door, bringing meals he wouldn't eat. On day 40, his supervisor filed a formal intervention request. On day 50, the medics overrode his door lock and found him standing in the center of his quarters, swaying slightly, murmuring to someone who wasn't there. His eyes were open but unfocused, tracking movements in a world only he could see. When they finally removed the visor, he was responsive but diminished, present in body, absent in every way that mattered. The medics said it was a form of dissociative withdrawal. The brain had reorganized itself around the projection, and without it the real world was too thin, too flat, too empty of the richness the Mandala had provided. Harlan lived, but he lived the way a photograph lives, fixed flat, a record of something that used to move. Last I heard, he was in a long-term care facility on one of the inner stations. His body functioned. His eyes tracked light. But the man who had loved his wife enough to follow her ghost into an alien machine, that man was gone. The Mandala had given him exactly what he asked for, and the cost was everything he hadn't thought to protect. The station administration locked the Mandala in a containment lab. The research team argued for continued study. The ethics board argued for destruction. As of the day I left Farsight, the argument was still going on. I suspect it always will be. Humanity has never been good at walking away from a mirror that shows us what we want. Dita and I didn't survive as a couple. I want to be honest about that, because this story doesn't earn its ending if I pretend otherwise. She came to my quarters a week after the visor went dark, and she sat on the edge of the bunk, and she told me, with more kindness than I deserved, that she couldn't be with me right now. Maybe not ever. Not because she didn't care, she did, she said, and I believed her, but because she needed to learn how to stand in her own life without leaning on anyone. Not Eid, not a hologram, not me. She needed time, real time, not the compressed, consequence-free time inside the visor to grieve properly. For Eid, for her father, for the years she'd lost to guilt and the months she'd lost to the illusion. I understood. Understanding doesn't make it hurt less, but it makes the hurt make sense, and on the frontier, that's about as much as you can ask for. She went back to the memorial on A deck. She went regularly. She stood in front of Brasco's plaque and she talked to him, really talked, without the visor, without the filter, without the comfortable lie that he could hear her and respond. She visited Eid's grandmother every week, and they drank tea and told stories about Eid that were true, that included the fights and the frustrations and the parts of him that were difficult and real, not the sanitized, idealized ghost the Mandala had constructed from Dita's longing. She finished Eid's last puzzle, the trail he'd laid before he died. The final clue brought her to a spot on the observation deck where, if you stood at exactly the right angle, the crack in panel 7 framed Kappa Ursae perfectly. The dying star, ancient and red and still burning, held inside a flaw in the glass like a jewel in a setting. I think Eid meant it as a metaphor. He was like that. Everything was a riddle with a meaning underneath. And the meaning was usually something about impermanence and beauty, and the courage it takes to look at something you love and accept that it won't last. I ran into Dita at the observation deck about a month before I transferred off Farsight. She was standing at panel 7, looking at the star through the crack. No visor, no wristband, just her eyes and the glass and the old red light. She looked tired, not the bone-deep exhaustion of grief, but the ordinary tired of someone who has been working hard and sleeping honestly and carrying only the weight that belongs to them. She looked real. "Ifin," she said. "Dita." We stood there for a while. The station hummed around us, recyclers, ventilation, the low pulse of the mining rigs far below. The sounds of people living. The sounds of a place that keeps going because the people inside it choose to keep going, even when the alternative is easier and kinder and infinitely more comfortable. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know. Not just for the visor, for before, for not seeing you when you were standing right in front of me." I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. I didn't say I forgave her, because forgiveness isn't a thing you hand over in a conversation on an observation deck. It's something that happens slowly, like a hull patch curring, and you don't know it's solid until you test it against vacuum. "You did a hard thing," I said. "You put it down." "You did a harder thing," she said. "You stayed." The Mandala is still out there, locked in its containment lab on Farsight, or maybe transferred to some research facility deeper in human space, where people with advanced degrees and institutional funding are trying to figure out what it is and what it means, and whether the species that built it found peace or simply disappeared into their own memories. I don't know the answer. I don't think the answer matters. What matters is this: an alien intelligence older than our species built a machine that could give you back everything you'd lost. Every face, every voice, every moment of warmth and connection and love. It offered it freely, without malice, without cost, or without any cost it could understand. And the only defense against it, the only thing that could break its hold, was the willingness to stand in the real world and feel the absence and choose to stay anyway. The aliens who built the Mandala never developed that defense. They had no word for it, no concept, No biological framework for the idea that grief could be a form of loyalty, that missing someone could be a way of honoring them, that the pain of loss was not a flaw to be corrected, but a signal that something had mattered. They built their perfect machine and they used it and they vanished into the comfort it provided, and the universe went on without them. Humans are different, not better, not smarter, not stronger, just different in this one specific, stubborn, infuriating way. We can look at the thing we want most in the world, the thing that would make the pain stop, the thing that would give us back everything we've lost, and we can put it down. Not because we don't want it, because we know that wanting it forever would cost us everything else. Dita put it down. It was the hardest thing she ever did, and it didn't fix anything, and the people she loved were still dead, and the guilt didn't disappear, and the world on the other side of the visor was still gray and recycled and imperfect. But it was real, and she chose it. That's the human thing, I suppose. The thing no alien system can account for. We don't beat grief. We don't conquer loss. We just keep choosing the world that hurts over the dream that doesn't, because somewhere in the deep wiring of what we are, we know that the hurt is the proof that we were here, that they were here, that it mattered. I transferred to a station closer to the core worlds. Quieter work, less frontier, more paperwork. Sometimes, late in the shift cycle, I stand at whatever viewport is nearest and I look out at the stars, and I think about a red dwarf dying in slow motion, framed by a crack in the glass. I think about a woman taking off a visor. I think about the courage that takes, not the dramatic courage of battle or last stands, but the quiet, grinding, unglamorous courage of deciding to feel the loss rather than escape it. That's the story, not a victory, not a defeat, just people doing the hardest thing people do. Letting go of what they love and staying.